You ever notice how every conversation about society turns into a generational blame game? Boomers did this, millennials ruined that, Gen Z is glued to their phones. And then there's this whole group sitting quietly in the middle, barely mentioned. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They're the ones at work who don't talk much, but somehow everything gets handled. The parent who showed up every day but never made a big deal about it. The people who helped build the internet and then chose not to live their lives on it. And if you really look at them closely, their psychology is something else. It all starts with how they grew up. A lot of them were what people call latchkey kids. Not a rare situation. This was normal. Picture this for a second. You're 8 years old. It's the late 70s. The school bus drops you off, and you walk home alone. You've got a house key tied to your shoelace or hanging around your neck. You open the door, and the house is empty. No parents, no babysitter, no phone to call anyone easily, definitely no internet. You pour yourself some cereal, turn on the TV, maybe flip through a couple of channels, and just exist until someone gets home. By the mid-80s, millions of kids were living like this every day. That kind of childhood does something to you. You learn early that no one's coming to rescue you. If something goes wrong, you deal with it. If you mess up, you face it. There's no quick call to a parent asking, "What should I do?" You just decide and then live with whatever happens next. That builds a very specific kind of brain. You start thinking ahead. You weigh consequences. You run little what-if scenarios in your head without even realizing it. That's why a lot of Gen X people seem like they can spot problems before they happen. It's not negativity, it's practice. They've been doing it since they were kids. But there's another layer to this. While they were figuring life out on their own, they were also watching the adults around them and noticing something didn't add up. They heard a lot about loyalty, commitment, doing the right thing. Then they watched marriages fall apart. Divorce rates climbed fast in the 70s and 80s. They saw parents dedicate decades to a company, only to get laid off without warning. So the lesson that stuck wasn't what people said, it was what actually happened. Don't rely too much on promises. Don't assume systems are stable. Don't expect things to go the way you were told they would. That doesn't turn you bitter. It turns you prepared. You hope things go well, of course you do, but you're always quietly ready for the opposite. That's where that Gen X detached vibe comes from. It's not that they don't care. It's that they've learned not to fully lean on anything that could disappear. Now look at how they behave online. It's interesting, right? These are the same people who helped build the digital world, early internet culture, tech systems, all of that. And yet, many of them barely post. They scroll, they observe, but they don't share much. That's not because they don't understand it. It's because they remember life before everything was recorded. Back then, if you embarrassed yourself, maybe a few people saw it, maybe it came up as a joke later, then it was gone. It didn't live forever. So the idea of putting your whole life online doesn't feel freeing to them. It feels risky. They grew up with privacy as the default, and once you've had that, it's hard to give it up for attention or likes. Then there's their sense of humor. If you've ever noticed Gen X humor, it's very dry, ironic, a bit distant. Nothing is taken too seriously. That didn't come from nowhere. They grew up during the Cold War. As kids, they were literally taught what to do in case of a nuclear attack. Hide under a desk, like that would help. At the same time, adults were saying everything was fine. So you're living in this weird reality where on one hand, the world could end any day, but on the other hand, you're supposed to act normal. When you grow up in that kind of contradiction, you learn to cope in your own way. You keep things light, you joke, you don't get too emotionally invested, because getting too attached to anything feels dangerous. And yet, despite all that, their work ethic is solid in a very quiet way. They're not the ones posting about hustle or motivation. They just do the work. A lot of them started working early, real responsibility at a young age, paper routes before sunrise, part-time jobs where you had to deal with customers, handle money, solve problems on the spot. No apps, no backup systems. If something broke, you figured it out. And watching their parents get burned by companies made something very clear. Don't trust the company, trust your own ability. So instead of chasing titles or recognition, they focus on being useful, being the person who knows what they're doing, the one you can't easily replace. That's their version of job security. There's also an interesting contradiction in how they deal with people. They're extremely independent, almost to a fault. They don't like asking for help, even when they probably should. But if you need help, they're there. No announcement, no "look what I did." They just show up and handle it. That comes from growing up relying on friends more than adults. Those friendships weren't casual. They were survival level important. And that kind of loyalty doesn't go away. Now, when it comes to authority, Gen X has a very specific filter. They don't care about titles. You can be a manager, a CEO, whatever. If you actually know what you're doing, they'll respect you. If you don't, they'll see through it immediately. Because they've spent their whole lives watching people in charge make bad decisions. So they don't blindly follow. They evaluate, quietly, but very accurately. Economically, they've also taken hit after hit. Different parts of this generation walked into adulthood during different crises. Recessions, market crashes, job instability. So the idea of one stable career for life, that never really felt real to them. That's why a lot of them don't rely on just one income stream. It's not about ambition, it's about protection. They've learned the hard way that anything can disappear, so you spread your risk. But there's a downside to all this independence. When things get tough, they don't naturally reach out. Not because they don't have people, but because somewhere deep down, asking for help feels like failing. They were wired to handle things on their own, and that wiring doesn't just switch off. It makes them strong in a crisis, but it can also make things heavier than they need to be. Their relationship with information is also very different from what we're used to now. Before search engines, finding an answer took effort. You had to go to a library, look things up manually, spend time digging. Because of that, when you learned something, it stuck. It wasn't instant. It cost you time and energy. And the same goes for practical skills. If something broke, you didn't replace it immediately. You tried to fix it. You experimented. You got your hands dirty. Over time, that builds confidence. This belief that I can probably figure this out. Now, many of them are raising kids in a completely different world. Constant supervision, constant connection, everything documented. They've given their kids what they didn't have. More attention, more safety. But there's also this quiet concern. Maybe too much protection makes you dependent. Maybe being constantly visible makes you vulnerable. Because from their perspective, staying a little under the radar was always safer. And here's the thing. Generation X isn't better than anyone else. They're just shaped by a very specific time. They grew up in the gap between two worlds, before the digital explosion, but close enough to build it. Before constant supervision, but close enough to see what it looks like. They're like a bridge, and bridges don't get celebrated. Nobody stops to admire them. They just hold everything together while people pass over them. That's kind of the Gen X identity. Do the work, don't make noise, don't expect recognition. Just handle what needs to be handled and keep moving. And honestly, that quiet, no-drama reliability, that might be the most defining thing about them.